This is Dr. Weislogel, and this is the second part of a discussion about the essay, What is the Point of Philosophy by Ignacio Ellacuria, an essay that appeared in the journal Abra in 1976, an essay that was turned into a pamphlet for beginning students of philosophy for his university, the UCA, as we call it, the University of Central America in San Salvador, Simeon Cañas. We'll have a chance to talk more about that university as the course continues. So let's pick up our discussion in section 2 of this essay, Philosophy as a Mode of Knowing. And in this section, he's going to compare philosophy both to science and in the various branches of philosophy to each other and to religion a little bit. So, appearance and reality. This is a question for philosophers that's as old as the hills. Here's a fact. Things do not show themselves to us immediately and transparently. It is unimaginable. You could try this thought experiment, but it won't work. Try to imagine what it would be like for anything you view, anything that comes into view, your laptop, a coffee cup, anything, a tree. And imagine what it would be like if somehow that experience gave us everything about, let's say, that tree all at once. We don't, that can't happen. We see the front of the tree, we can look up, we could look down, we could walk around the tree, we could cut into the tree, we could study it at a microscopic level, we could dig down and see its roots. Same with everything else. Certainly same with us human beings. We don't all show ourselves all at once. We can't. It's not possible. That's not how things are for us. Human existence as we know it would be unthinkable if things somehow did show themselves to us immediately and transparently. We have no idea how to imagine that. We learn things gradually. Things reveal themselves to us gradually. And that means things show themselves as they appear. They appear, like with the tree, differently from different angles, differently in different lights, differently depending on how we're investigating that tree. Fine. Opinion would be to remain at that level of appearances, that we take the way things show themselves to be what that thing is, to be immediately and transparently that thing. That would be a mistake. Knowledge would be the attainment of the reality about that object. That's what it would take to have true knowledge. So knowledge and opinion are distinguished in that way. Things certainly show themselves in appearances and maybe perspectively and temporally. All that's undeniable. The mistake is to think that how we happen to be experiencing things is everything about those experiences. Science seeks to know with certainty. That is a modern desire for knowledge. We want certainty. In fact, the philosopher Richard Bernstein refers to it as Cartesian anxiety. The Descartes wanted one thing as a philosopher. He wanted certainty, right? And what counts as certainty? The results of verifiable, quantifiable experiments. And that leads to our understanding of how things function. And we can express how things function in laws, in scientific laws. That's what science does. It wants to know things with certainty, but certainty has a kind of meaning. That meaning is certainty comes from verifiable experiments, and what the certainty provides is a recognition of how things function, which is expressible in laws. Philosophy seeks to know how a thing is in reality. What it really is. And that word reality is going to be super important for us. Javier Zubiri, Ellacuria's teacher and a colleague, that he could be called the philosopher of reality. That was his main subject matter in everything he did, Zubiri, as we will see. So that has a very precise meaning that's going to reveal itself as we go along here. But Ellacuria is trying to make a point. Truth is not simply scientific certainty. It's not that's too narrow to say the truth is only what science can tell you. Truth cannot be fully contained by laws. It's a too sterile understanding of truth. Now, I have this note here to review Descartes and the modern turn, and I'll post something about that so you could take a look at it. But the short story is this. Descartes desired certainty. He got what he wanted, or at least he got what he thought he wanted, certainty, by dividing reality into two. He basically divided into two. And he put on one side everything that you could weigh, measure, take apart, put back together again. Everything that we collectively, in a public manner, using the scientific method of experiment and peer review and all those things, particularly things that we could quantify, that we could look at in terms of numbers, put everything on one side that you could talk about like that. And anything that you could not talk about like that, he moved over into the other side. And he says in the first side, the stuff that you could quantify, that's where you would have certainty. That's where you would have knowledge. And everything on the other side, since you couldn't apply the scientific quantitative method to it, you didn't have certainty. So therefore you didn't have knowledge. It was opinion, and even considered like a mere opinion. Like the difference between your opinion that vanilla is the best ice cream rather than chocolate's the best ice cream. Well, what kind of things were in that second category? The stuff that you can't weigh and measure and scientifically prove and quantify. What's in that? Everything that matters to us. Our spiritual views, religious views, our ethical views, political views, our aesthetic judgments, all of that which makes human life human gets relegated to the other side of the wall that divides the certain and knowledge from that which is opinion or even mere opinion. And Ellacuria is a postmodern, I think, if I could put it that way, in the sense that modernity bought into this idea that knowledge only comes through scientific practice, that there wasn't another kind of truth, there wasn't another kind of knowledge. Now, don't misunderstand. Postmodernism is not saying whatever you think is true, that there are alternative facts. Science gives you the facts. Science does give you the what. But there's a lot of truth in the so what of things. And that you can't get an answer to doing an experiment. In other words, you can't do an experiment to say which religion is the most fruitful for us human beings, if that's a real question. No scientific experiment can really do that, because no scientific experiment could tell us exactly what we would mean by fruitful. We have to decide that in other ways. It's not to say, though, that anything goes. And we'll return to this question, this common criticism of postmodern. Ellacuria is postmodern simply in his assertion that truth is wider and richer than what we get through science. He's not anti-science at all. One of the main things, the UCA, which Ellacuria was the rector of that university, like the president of that university at one point, one of the main things they did was develop highly technical, competent, comprehensive social science as a university. That was a goal of his. So he's certainly not against science in any way. He doesn't think, oh, well, science says this or that about vaccines, but I saw something on Facebook, mom's group, so they're all the same. No, no. He's making a point. Science gives you a certain knowledge. It does. It tells you how things function. All right, the stuff that you can express in laws, causes and effects. Yes, it can tell you about that. But there's other truths that matter to us human beings that are not those kind of truths. He has a richer idea of enlightenment, if you want to put it that way, than the Enlightenment, than modernity. All right, so that's just an overview, but that's what he's trying to say here. Philosophy and science need each other, he says. Philosophers run the risk of speculating and of presenting as real that which is only the result of their speculation. They sit in an armchair and just think stuff up. Right? Scientists run the risk of denying reality to something that is real and that, moreover, can be operative or matter or effective, although in a form not directly verifiable, or as I would put it, quantifiable. So you need both philosophers and science. You need, like lungs, you need them both to breathe. Philosophy cannot accomplish the critical task by itself. It needs the collaboration of scientific analyses. Scientific analysis belongs intrinsically to the work of philosophy, although it is neither its totality nor its differentiating elements. So philosophy is not science. It's not another science. but you can't do philosophy right without science, and science has to be practiced very competently in order for the findings to be of value to the work of philosophy. So they definitely need each other. But scientific analysis by itself is too sterile. It doesn't give us the kind of understanding, insight, or answers that we really need. Questions of philosophy. What is true knowledge? Well, that's the epistemological question. And Ellacuria says, look, we're about seeking to the ultimate and total why. Not just the connections of antecedents. This came before that, and then that came before something else. We want to know the why of all that sequence that science can help us understand the facts of. We want the ultimate and total why. We want to know what real knowledge would mean. What is reality? Well, that's metaphysics. That's where metaphysics comes into play. Philosophy is a kind of second knowing. What is a human being in relation to reality? Well, that demands history to be taken into account. What are we talking about here? Second knowing and history. Well, we know what things are. We say, well, what is that? Well, that's a tree. Yeah, but what is it really? And what has been the relationship between humans and trees, humans in the natural world, humans thinking of the world as a home, thinking of the world as resources, as raw material, as marketing material, manufacturing material. We know trees, but the second know is, well, what is that really for us? How is that in relation to us, and how are we in relation to reality? And that's something that reveals itself over time. History is a fundamental element of the being of human beings. So metaphysics, our question, what is reality, has to take into account time, has to take into account history and the unfolding of how things really are. You can't just say, as of today, here's how things really are, the end. Put it in a book, put it on the shelf, we're done with that project. No. And then we have to ask, what is the meaning of reality? Once we get to reality, science gives us the fact, epistemology gives us the facts, and then metaphysics or philosophy gives us the idea of what's the meaning of all that. Was it really? And then what is the meaning of that reality? That, Ellacuria says, is theology. And now we have the combination that we're going to see interwoven throughout this course of philosophy and religion, philosophy and theology. The question is, does human life have a meaning? Is there a meaning to all this that we're involved in? Part 3 of this essay is very important, and we'll be using some of the core ideas of this section throughout the rest of the course. So try to take good notice of what everything Ellacuria wants to say here. The section's entitled Philosophy as a Principle of Disideologization. So we'll learn what that is all about. But that's, for Ellacuria, it may be one of the most important core concepts of what philosophy is all about. So, question, does philosophy serve the prevailing order or threaten the prevailing order? Does philosophy serve the prevailing order or threaten the prevailing order? You might think from the example of Socrates that philosophy, with all of its questions, is always a threat. You might know the story of Aristotle. He once took a job as the tutor for the son of Philip of Macedon, little Alexander, as he was probably thought of back then. And Aristotle, of course, tutored Alexander, who, as you probably know, grew up to be Alexander the Great, tutored Alexander in the ways of the philosopher. And at a certain point, it became clear that the lessons that Alexander was learning from Aristotle were unnerving in some ways to his father. The lad was asking too many questions about the nature of justice, the nature of proper rule, and who gets to be in charge, and all those kind of questions. And Aristotle was fired in those days under threat of serious termination, execution, like Socrates. Aristotle's philosophical questioning proved to be, or seem at least, threatening to the powers that be at his time, just like Socrates' questioning seemed to be threatening. But is it always that way? Can philosophy serve to prop up or support the prevailing order? Does it always have to be seen as a threat? That's a complicated question, as it turns out. Is philosophy a principle of ideologization, or is it a principle of disideologization? Now, those are many syllable words there that we're going to have to try to learn. But that second question is in many respects just a restatement of the first question. It's a restatement of the first question. So let's see how that works. What is ideology? Ideology is the more or less systematic combination of ideas of a person or of a group. Right? Ideology can be thought of as an expression or an articulation of reality. So here's what I want to say. For many philosophers, including some we'll meet later on, in particular Enrique Dussel, ideology always is something bad or something nefarious. But for Ellacuria, and this is very important, ideology is not only bad. In fact, he basically argues that we cannot live a human life without some kind of ideology. Think of them as lenses. Without any lenses whatsoever, you cannot see. Right? You need lenses, and our ideologies, or personal or group or national ideologies, can be thought of as a way of seeing, putting our reality into some ideas so that they make kind of sense of us. So you can't live without some kind of an expression or an articulation of reality. You can't live a human life like that. However, in the attempt to represent reality in ideas, it becomes an effort sometimes to hide or obscure reality, usually for someone's benefit or interest, but not everybody's benefit or interest. So if you think of it this way, ideology can be viewed not as a way of seeing reality, an expression or articulation of the way things really are, but as a substitute for reality, as something other than what's really real. If you want to put it this way, a set of lenses that comes to distort our vision of what's really real, and distort it in such a way that it serves certain people's interest and not others. Now, the first understanding of ideology, we can't live without. It's a necessity of human existence. We need lenses, so to speak. The second one is the reason that many people hear the word ideology as purely negative, because they're hearing ideology as the set of lenses that distort or hide reality from us. Usually, again, for someone's benefit, not our own. Ellacuria has a very interesting dynamic of the interplay of these two uses, so to speak, or these two presentations of ideology. Well, I mentioned the sophists earlier, that group of thinkers around the time of Socrates that recognize that ideology, a statement or articulation of reality, can be used as an autonomous weapon, in Ellacuria's words, either at the service of domination or against it. The sophists were those who argued for a price, if I could put it that way. They are thinkers who took up a person's case and tried to present reality in a way that was best, apparently best for those people. You could think of them maybe as lawyers in our adversarial legal system. You don't want a lawyer who's trying to get at the absolute truth. What you want is a lawyer who's going to make a case that's in your best interest, just like the prosecutor is going to make a case that's against your best interest and allegedly society's best interest. All that can be debated. Ideology, ways of seeing, are autonomous in that way. It's like a tool that you could pick up and use to argue against, to show domination at work and argue against it, or it could be used to reinforce that domination, to get people to look at it a certain way so they don't notice that they're being repressed or oppressed or dominated. This points to what Ellacuria says, the relative autonomy of thought. On the one hand, every thought is situated. You don't think in a vacuum. The ideas you have, the language that you use, have come to you, for the most part, from the outside. Thought has an immediate relationship with a personal and socio-historical context. I have a question here that says, can you think of examples? Well, I'll leave it to you to think of a lot of examples, but the things that we find important, the things that we get concerned about or that we find ourselves talking about, how did we come to value those things? Why did those become the topics? Why are these the shows we watch? Why are these the things we get all worked up about? Why are these the practices that we're all engaged in? All of our thoughts are embedded in a context. There's no non-embedded thoughts. It's not possible. So we're stuck in a certain ways. But on the other hand, no thought is completely determined by any context. There is always a feature of thought that can transcend its context. Transcendent, at least relatively. It can't be fully free from all context, but there's an aspect of thought that could recontextualize the situation, to look at things in a different way, to re-ideologize reality, to see a different expression of the historical reality, and therefore transcend the thoughts that had previously been organized or constructed in a social historical context, maybe not in your best interest. Thought can liberate itself from itself. Now, if that's not true, let me tell you how important that claim is. If that's not true, then we're done here. If thought can't liberate itself from itself, we are done here. If your thoughts are fully and completely determined and constructed from social context, they are not even your thoughts at all. It makes no real meaningful sense to talk about your thoughts because they're not yours. They're not your own. You are a mouthpiece. You are ventriloquizing, if you want to put it that way. The society is a ventriloquist. It's speaking through you, but it's not you. Now, I think we can agree that thought must be able to liberate itself. It can come to see how ideology has been constructed and can work to disideologize those contexts and get us to see things differently. So conditions for thought, which there's no unconditional thought. There's no thought outside of a context. The conditions both make possible and limit thought and action. And I can give you an example of what I mean by conditions in this sense. If I give you an analogy with cards, if I take a deck of playing cards, 52 playing cards, and I plunk them down in front of you and I say, let's play. Well, your first question is going to be, well, what are we playing? Do you want to play blackjack or do you want to play Texas Hold'em? Those are two card games. Well, when you put a name on them, like blackjack or Texas Hold'em, those don't mean anything other than the rules of blackjack or Texas Hold'em. And the rules of blackjack say a certain set of cards is really good, but that same set of cards in Texas Hold'em would be terrible, and vice versa. It's only the conditions, the rules of the game that give meaning to the cards, that give meaning to the thoughts you have about your cards, what you want to do next, what your next play is, and so forth. So if you had 4 kings and an ace in Texas Hold'em, you're looking good. If you have 4 kings and an ace in blackjack, you've gone way over what you're supposed to do. It's terrible. It was terrible before you even got to 4 kings and an ace. It's terrible. The conditions make the game possible. If you had no rules, you couldn't play anything. There's no game. But they also limit the moves of the game, what counts as winning and what counts as losing. You understand that? That's what Kant, by the way, meant when he talked about critique, his critical philosophy. He wanted to try to show the conditions of possibility, in his case of thought or of making moral judgments. And the conditions of possibility of thought, for instance, also limits what actually can be thought coherently. That's Kant's philosophy. We're going to use this idea of critique. We're going to use this understanding that critique or conditions, context, make possible and at the same time and necessarily limit what can be thought, what moves can be made, what's going to count as valuable, and what's not going to count as valuable. Playing cards. So what this points to, again, is this idea of relative autonomy, right? You could do what you want in a card game. You could make choices. You could make moves. You could decide to take a card or fold or whatever. But the rules don't strictly determine what you do. You know, all different players at the table playing blackjack or Texas Hold'em are going to do different things. But they can't do just any old thing. They can't take 12 cards in Texas Hold'em, things like that. You can't just do anything. You have autonomy. You're able to make choices and make decisions, but it's always kind of relative. Relative autonomy, important concept for Ellacuria that we'll have to think about. The possibility of ideology rests on the fact that thought is not strictly determined by conditions or by context. I mean, that again, we can't stress enough how important this idea is. If thought were strictly determined, we wouldn't even be thinkers. It wouldn't even make sense to say that we were thinking. We were just wind-up toys making sounds with our mouth. That would be it. So ideology rests on the fact that thought is not strictly determined, which means we can re-ideologize. And Ellacuria says, the only ones who think the same are those who do not think. That's a funny kind of sentence, and maybe it's a little bit of a koan, one of those Zen mind twisters, that make you see things or think things a little differently than you normally would. What does he mean here? He says, look, if we all thought exactly the same thing as everybody else, and exactly the same thing as we thought yesterday and the day before and the day before, it is no longer meaningful to say that we're thinking. It's no longer meaningful to say that we are thinkers. So thinking has a dynamism for Ellacuria that we don't want to lose. We don't want to tamp down the dynamism of thought in our haste to try to get some kind of certainty. That's what Descartes did in a way. He was so eager to get certainty that in a way he brought his thinking to a halt by just cutting out some things worth thinking about, because he only thought in a certain kind of quantitative way. We want a richer understanding of who we are and how we think. Ellacuria writes, every dominant system wants to place restrictions on thought and seeks paid thinkers to defend and propagate it. Oh, that's another one that you could write a whole long essay on, couldn't you? Try to figure out whether there are examples that you could see in the world around you. This goes back to this idea that we saw before, that the state doesn't want to have pure freedom of thought. Why? Because thought, when it is relatively autonomous, when it pushes towards its autonomy, is a threat to the ideology, the expression or the articulation of reality, which includes what's valuable, that has been benefiting the powers that be in any society. Remember what Ellacuria says, when you get into philosophy, it's a polemos, it's a struggle. It's a struggle against yourself, and it's a struggle against the powers that be. The powers that be are benefiting from the particular ideology of a society. They have set it up so that we, hopefully, from their point of view, see things a certain kind of way, don't ask a lot of questions, who stop thinking because we see it the same as we're supposed to see it, because that benefits them. And from the time of the sophists to our own days with our talking heads on television and then social media, the powers that be have employed thinkers to defend that system, to make people who ask questions seem bad, seem dangerous, seem evil, seem alien. It benefits the powers that be to not have the ideology questioned, to not let people take off the lenses. So what's philosophy's role in this? How does philosophy come to ideologize, right? In what lies the critical potential of philosophy? He says in two things: doubt and negation. Doubt and negation. By doubt, he's talking about just the raising of the question. But is it this way? Is this the best way for us to be? Is what they're calling justice really just? Is how we're dealing with each other in society really honest, really true, really good? And negation is the idea that you could turn it upside down, that you could see what else might happen, right? Dogmatists, right? You know about dogma. That's a belief that ought not to be questioned. So dogmatists, true unquestioning believers, tend to see philosophy as heretical or revisionist, right? The dogmatists, the ones who are fully bought in, all in with the current ideology of the same, see philosophy as people who are heretics. That word comes from a word that means kind of choosy, like they're choosing something else, or they're revising what's gone on. And they see that heresy or that revisionism as dangerous. I'm just laying it out there for you to think about. Think about in our current situation when we're doing a lot of revisiting of our monuments that are put in the town square of different people, and buildings who are named after certain people, and so forth, because of our unjust and racist history. Think about how those who want to look at that, to ask those questions, should we have this building named after this person? Should this person's statue be up there? The very asking of the question, not the answer to the question, but just the very asking of the question is seen as heretical or dangerous to the powers that be, to the reigning ideology. Doubt and negation, how does that come about? Ellacuria says, well, you got to slow down action. So many people are quick to act. Oh, they make a hot take and they go. And Ellacuria says, look, that's not a left or right thing. That's my advice to everybody. Look before you leap. Slow things down so you can see what's really going on. He thinks that that doubt and negation, the philosophy as a principle of disideologizing, showing how ideologies got constructed and who they benefit and how they might be different, requires a kind of disruption of monolithic organizations. Organizations that are, the ones they say are too big to fail, the giant size, old organizations that have organized our interactions and practices in different areas in certain structured kind of ways. I think because of the pandemic that we're all going through, we are sitting in one of those monolithic organizations right now, the university, that's getting itself disrupted by this outside force of the pandemic, but it's bringing to light the ideologies that have organized our way of thinking, which we had to have. We had to have them. We had to have some understanding of what counts as education and what's important about it. But it's bringing up questions that we're all, faculty, administrators, students alike, are finding uncomfortable. Doubt negation is served by allowing for individualistic freedom. It's important that each one of us have a chance to try as best we can, always within a context, always within some kind of ideological framework, to try to see things for ourselves, try to figure some things out for ourselves, to have the freedom of choice and decision. We need to show the autonomy of thought, to show that our thoughts aren't strictly determined by our social context and reigning ideology. And doubt negation can convert the determinateness of everything, when we just say it is what it is, into indeterminateness. Again, we are made to fear the indeterminate. We are made to fear the uncertain. Right? We're made to think that's bad. But why is that bad? Why was it bad that Socrates could say, I know that I don't know? Why does that have to be bad? Right? It turns necessity, it is what it is, that's just the way it is, into a kind of liberty. Doubt negation can slow things down. It can help disrupt these monolithic organizations. It helps to allow us to have our individualistic freedom. It can help us to realize the autonomy of our thought, and it could shake things up in a healthy kind of way to restore the dynamism both of thought and of action, and therefore of our human being. In a section titled Philosophy, Totality, and Transcendence, Ellacuria notes that philosophy is transgressive. It seeks not to be bound by limits. Well, why does it do that? Well, it does it in questioning. It doesn't take for granted the appearance. It says, okay, I see how things appear, but why did they appear like that? What's not appearing in all these appearances? I see the actuality. What are the possibilities in that actuality? That's how philosophy operates. He says, in fact, it seeks to transcend, quote, even the totality of totalities in order to be able to focus on them as a unity. What's he trying to say here? The totality of totalities, all the totalities, what's a totality? Here's what education is all about. Here's what business is all about. Here's what America is all about. Here's what religion is all about. Those are totalities. And the totality of all those, philosophy can get in a way up above or underneath or inside of, or however, whatever spatial metaphor you want to use, to try to focus on how those things kind of go together. And when he says that, it reminded me of this famous saying by Periander, Melete topan, study everything, have a concernful care for the whole of your existence. Don't mistake the part for the whole. Don't mistake the part for the whole. Try to get beyond that. And look, that's risky business. I'm going to admit it. It could lead to evasion or alienation, and that's a word that we are going to talk about later on. It's an important word in this course. Or even a kind of mysticism about things where you feel like I have gotten beyond. I have fully transcended. Well, if you somehow think you have transcended your context or your culture or the way people do things, it's going to be hard to know what you're actually talking about, right? If thought is always in a context, then the meaning of what you say is a function of the context we all find ourselves in. So if you somehow slipped out of that context altogether, I'm not sure we're going to know what you're saying, or whether even you will know exactly what you're saying, or maybe you're just going to feel like I got out of it. There's this idea that philosophy itself is a kind of evasion. I think that's what old Marco Rubio was talking about. That philosophers, they're trying to get out of the business. They're trying to go up on the mountaintop and contemplate their navel and not be very productive and have nothing to do with everything else. Just a way to get out of a bad business. That's not what's being called for here. It's a temptation, but that's not really what's being said here. Why is philosophy transgressive like that? Because we are. Because human beings always are more than whatever they are at the moment. The French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, very, very famous philosopher. You get interested in that, you take a course in existentialism, you learn all about him and many other thinkers, a number of whom we'll mention this semester. He said, the human being is what it is not, and is not what it is. It is what it is not, and is not what it is. We never coincide with ourselves. It is a fact that I am a professor, that I'm a husband, that I'm a father and a grandpa. I am that, but I'm not just that. I'm not only that. And even what it means to be that is to be determined. What kind of a professor do I turn out to be? What kind of a philosopher I turn out to be? What kind of a husband or a parent or grandparent do I turn out to be? That's always TBD. That's always to be determined. Human beings are self-transcendent beings. That's our kind of imitation of divine infinity, limitlessness. We're not absolutely unlimited. We're relatively unlimited. We're not gods, but we are not just stuck by the limits of what we have going on, what Sartre would call our facticity, the bells that can't be unrung about us, where we were born and what our physical attributes are and what the economic and political conditions are in which we find ourselves. Those are facts, and you don't want to be in denial about the facts. But what those facts turn out to mean is something that is going to take the future to figure out. We don't know at this point. We are always moving beyond our limits. But we have to remember that that doesn't mean we get to escape. That's a kind of irresponsibility that no philosopher would endorse. All right? And the question is it worth this risk of maybe falling into evasion or alienation or even mysticism? Friedrich Nietzsche said something that stuck with me, the 19th century German thinker who's considered a forerunner of those existentialist philosophers I just mentioned. He said the following: "Indeed, the crowd, the many, the hoi polloi, the crowd has for a long time misjudged and mistaken the philosopher, whether for a scientific man, an ideal scholar, that's a mistake, or for a religiously elevated, desensualized, desecularized enthusiast, and sot, a drunk for God." That's not a philosopher. And if a man or a person is praised today for living wisely or as a philosopher, it hardly means more than prudently and apart. Wisdom seems to the rabble a kind of escape, a means and a trick for getting well out of a wicked game. But the genuine philosopher, as it seems to us, my friends, lives unphilosophically and unwisely and above all imprudently, and feels the burden and the duty of 100 attempts and temptations of life. He risks himself constantly. He plays the wicked game. Now, notice that unphilosophically and unwisely are in scare quotes. He's trying to say if philosophy means and wisdom means to just live quietly and escape the rabble and don't take any risks and be satisfied with the same, then I don't want anything to do with it, because that's not really human. That's not really philosophical. That's, the herd can live like that. Humans that live like cattle, they can live like that, but not us philosophers. We got to play the wicked game, as he calls it. Well, in a way, Ellacuria, Socrates, those are thinkers who played the wicked game, the game of risk, the game of asking questions, the game of living with a kind of uncertainty and having the strength for that uncertainty. Ellacuria says, "Only one who consciously and critically sees in what is limited more than what is limited can disideologize, can prevent a part from being converted into the whole, the relative being converted into the absolute." That's the key to disideologization. You have to be able to recognize the part as a part. You have to be able to recognize lenses as lenses. You have to be able to recognize the appearances through those lenses, through those ideologies, as appearances, and recognize that there's more. The mistake is thinking that the part is the whole. The mistake is thinking what's relative is absolute. The end, the truth, done for everybody. The implication of this is philosophy is more in danger of being converted into ideology when it forsakes its critical task and undertakes its constructive and systematic one. Well, let's just talk about the first part of this. Philosophy has a job: ideologization, coming up with a good, clear set of lenses for seeing reality as it really is. That's a job, but the job carries a danger. The danger is it falls into the mistake of thinking that these nice, clear lenses that we're working very hard to get to help us see what's really going on might still be distorting things. And we think, when we feel like we have a clear vision, that it's the vision of reality as such, end of the game. So when philosophy is doing its very important job of trying to ideologize, it can fall into the idea of ideology as a substitute for reality, not lenses for viewing reality. Nevertheless, so there's a risk. Philosophy is not faithful to itself if it does not seek to be an explanatory system of the real. You have to take the philosophical risk of trying to see how things really are. You have to. You have to stay humble, but you have to make the effort. So here's where he talks about the glory and the failure of philosophy. The glory and the failure of philosophy. As representations or substitutions for reality, the great philosophies can be converted into ideologies in the negative sense and defraud those who go in search of reality itself. How's that happen? You have wonder. You want to know. You feel that urge, that call to philosophize, but you don't know how. So you read a book or you take a course. And at the end of reading that book or taking that course, you feel like that other person has answered things for you. But the risk of being defrauded in that way, of thinking that some other person, some other thinker's packaging of their answers would be good enough for you, is a fantasy. It's a mistake. But as instruments of approximation, those courses or those books, as ways that one is to travel along the road, the methodos, they are splendid means of realization. So what's the idea? If you think that what you do when you do philosophy is you get a book and you read it, or you take a course or a series of courses, you get a major, or you get a degree in philosophy, and if you think that at the end of that, you've got it, you have a philosophy, that it's done, that the dynamism is over, what you have there is something dead. But if you don't treat those books as ready-made answers, if you treat them as paths that you yourself have to walk along, as goads to thoughts that you have to think for yourself, questions you have to pose for yourself and to society. If you think of it that way, then Ellacuria is saying that wrestling with the great philosophers is a great way to go. It's a fantastic way to go. But if you fool yourself into thinking that, well, here's the answers, and I don't need to do it because Immanuel Kant did it for me or Aristotle did it for me, you've misunderstood what philosophy is. I'll be honest with you. When I was a young college student, and I felt that urge to philosophize, and I would go into the library and at the university, and I would go to the philosophy section. I'd see all those books, and I'd stand there gazing at this wall of books, and I'd think to myself, yeah, the answer's in one of these books. One of them's right. All the others are not right or not as right. I got that one book. If I just find that, that's the goal. It's like a treasure hunt. I was way wrong. I would have saved myself a world of hurt if I hadn't been reading and thinking about philosophy in that light so early in my career. So I hope that I can, and Ellacuria, that we together can get you to see philosophy, the kind of stuff we're doing here with thinking about philosophers and taking a course and trying to learn the method, to think of it as a pathway that you got to make your own. All right, let's take a break and we'll come back for the conclusion.